25th, a date which is still celebrated, although unofficially today in Belarus, as the Day of Freedom. On March 25th, 1918, there was the first attempt at independence in Belarus. So the Declaration of Independence by the Belarusian People's Republic, right? Which unfortunately was not successful. It did not survive because it was overrun by more powerful neighbors. So Belarusian lands were in fact partitioned by the Second Polish Republic and by the Soviet Union. And Belarus remained partitioned until 1939, so the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when Hitler and Stalin carved up Poland, and the ethnically Belarusian territories were, well, let's say, reunited as part of the Soviet Union, as the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. So the first attempt at independence didn't really work in the sense of establishing an independent Eastern European nation state in the way in which, let's say, Latvia's attempt worked at establishing an independent state. So in this sense, Belarus's situation is closer to Ukraine, right, than to Latvia. But the legacy of that survived. The legacy of the Belarusian People's Republic survived, and it was something that inspired the pro-independence movement in the 1980s, right? So with perestroika and the kind of crumbling of the totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union. So when Belarus became independent in 1991, following the disintegration of the USSR, its state symbols were actually identical to the symbols of the 1918 Belarusian People's Republic. Right, so the Pahonia and the red-white flag, which you see right here in the picture. So there was a kind of continuity. Now, of course, the situation in the early 90s was very difficult. Well, you might say, well, where was it easy? I mean, it was difficult everywhere in the kind of post-communist area. But Belarus had a very specific history. Without going too deep into what was going on in the 20th century and earlier, I would say that Belarus in particular was characterized by a pro-independence movement, which was comprised of quite a relatively small number of cultural and political elite who would have been dissidents. Well, some of them would have been dissidents, and under the Soviet regime, and they were actively in favor of independence. And then there was a group of post-communist former party members and managers, Soviet-style managers. So they called it nomenclatura, right? A very specific term. And those people were quite Sovietized, they were quite Russified. So they had this type of very Soviet mindset. So actually, they were not in favor of independence, at least not actively. Some of them were against it. They could not imagine their life in the new circumstances. It was difficult for them to imagine their life without Russia. So they naturally tended to be very pro-Russian and pro-Moscow. And of course, they hated the pro-independence cultural and political movement in Belarus. And then there was the masses, if you will, the majority of people who were, well, I mean, to be honest, they were not so prepared for independence, and they were confused. They were frustrated by the hardships of the transition, because Belarus, well, I mean, as compared to some other places, let's say in Russia, by Soviet standards, it was relatively well off, right? So as much as you could be well off in the Soviet Union, but if you compare it to some places in Russia, it was had a relatively decent consumption standard, and suddenly the changes came. And it was a shock for many people, so they were frustrated. They were frustrated by the hardships. They did not care so much about independence or national culture or the kind of geopolitical choices. Also mentally remained very closely attached to Russia. So under those circumstances, of course, it's not difficult to understand how Alexander Lukashenko managed to be elected as Belarus's first president in 1994. Here you see him on, laying his oath, right? Making his oath in 1994 after the election. You might observe that he's actually standing next to a red-white flag, not the red-green one, but the white flag. This is the coat of arms that you see here, and it doesn't mean that it's happening in Lithuania, but this is actually the official, in 1994, this is the official Belarusian coat of arms, which is, not identical, but it is the same coat of arms that the Belarusian People's Republic used in 1918. Right? Lukashenko came with a very populist take, political take. He represented everything that people who did not welcome the changes wanted to see. Right? So if you wanted to summarize his political message at that point in several words, you would say he was kind of promising to take the people back. Right? Let's go back. We don't like this new reality, the new post-communist reality. Let's go back to the USSR. And he managed to consolidate his power quite quickly. So there were two, in 2 years, in 1995, in 1996, there were two referenda in which he managed to change the state symbols. So Belarus went from the red-white flag back to the slightly altered Soviet flag, which was designed decades later. It was designed in 1951. It was slightly altered, and the slightly altered coat of arms, the Soviet coat of arms. Right, so that was on the symbolic level. Introduced Russian as a second state language, but as de facto as the first and the only state language. And he also introduced a new geopolitical course, which was all about integrating with Russia, right? So Belarus signed a treaty on the so-called Union State with Russia, right? Not to say that these ideas were not there before him, or without him, because, like I said, it was very the whole environment was very kind of pro-Soviet, pro-Russian, because this Soviet-raised nomenclatura was mentally, culturally, politically very much in favor of these things. But he, as a strong populist leader, managed to take it much further than these Soviet people ever could. Right? So he consolidated his power quite quickly. The referenda are, of course, disputed because, for instance, in in the 95 referendum, which changed the state symbols and introduced second state language. It's not clear whether that could have been done in a legal way to begin with, because the 1994 Constitution said clearly that you cannot, that state symbols and state language cannot be subject to any referendum. So from that point of view, you could argue that the referendum was actually anti-constitutional. Nobody cared about that. The 1996 referendum dissolved the parliament, and it established a new bicameral parliament for which Lukashenko handpicked the loyal MPs, deputies. And basically that is the point when Belarus stopped being a parliamentary democracy, right? Became an authoritarian regime. So the 90s, going back to the Union State, if you check out the treaty on the Union State, there are many things there. Practically, if you were to implement that treaty, you would merge Belarus and Russia into a single state. I mean, after all, this is what it is called, the Union State of Belarus and Russia. So there are many things that Lukashenko promised to Russia. Let's say a single currency, right? Whatever that was. Most people thought it would be the Russian ruble. A single parliament, a constitution, and there's supposed to be a constitutional act of the Union State. Now, what was in it for Lukashenko? What was in it for Russia? For Lukashenko, it was obvious. He needed political support from Russia because his domestic policy isolated him from the EU, from the West. And he relied very strongly on Russia for political support, but also for economic support. Right? And for Russia, it was strange because on the one hand, these were the days of Yeltsin, right? So this was still a relatively democratic Russia. This was before Putin came on stage and consolidated authoritarianism in Russia. But on the other hand, Lukashenko managed to exploit these imperial or imperialistic complexes that Russia had even in the 90s. In the 90s were a time everybody was trying to get away from Russia, or almost everybody, right? Right. So the Central and Eastern Europe, the former kind of external empire, was joining the European Union and NATO. The Baltic states were also on their way to join European Union and NATO. So nobody wanted to be Russia's friend, right? Put it in plain terms. And here you have a unique case of somebody who was promising, to quote from him, to integrate with Russia as closely as Russia would want. So everybody's running away from Russia, and this one guy is running in the opposite direction towards Russia. Also, he said something like, "I'm prepared to crawl on my knees to Russia." So there's a lot of rhetoric about brotherly love and alliance, eternal alliance with Belarus and Russia. So you could understand easily why Moscow was prepared to sponsor this regime, Belarus, because the kind of imperialist ego, the imperialist identity that Russia had that never quite disappeared even in the 90s, required the confirmation of Russia's status, Russia's special status as a great power, as somebody who has a sphere of influence. And Lukashenko managed to exploit this image of Russia's last ally, Russia's only ally, which Russia cannot, from Moscow's point of view, cannot afford to lose. But that was not all. For Lukashenko, who never intended to exchange Belarus's independence only for political support, the Union State was a chance to actually become the president of something larger than Belarus. Right? Because Yeltsin was aging, Yeltsin was an alcoholic, he was deeply unpopular, and Lukashenko was tremendously popular, not only in Belarus, but also in Russia. Right? Because also there were people in Russia to whom he could appeal with this message of let's go back. Let's go back to the strong state and the kind of Soviet times of stability and glory and brotherhood and all these things, which people started missing quite quickly in Russia with all the hardships and the instability of the 90s. The wild 90s or the roaring 90s as they would later came to be known, right? So Lukashenko apparently had a plan to use the Union State as a platform for becoming the president of both countries. But then came Vladimir Putin, because in Moscow, the Russian establishment, the oligarchs, and the so-called family, Yeltsin's inner circle, they had different ideas, had different plans. So Lukashenko never got the chance to become the president of the Union State. And after that, basically, the Union State became a stalemate, or you could call it a stillborn child, stillborn project. Because if you were to implement all the points of the Treaty on the Union State, that would mean that practically Lukashenko would lose his power as president. He would be no one. In Russia, he would be no one. Right? He would not be president of Belarus because Belarus would cease to exist. It's easy to understand why the Union State never actually happened. It remained a state on paper, right? So what it turned out to be kind of a never-ending game of integration, where Lukashenko would be promising, yes, of course, we're integrating, but you have to understand that we cannot afford to lose our sovereignty. There was no talk of sovereignty in the 90s, but the topic of sovereignty came up very quickly when he realized that he has no chance of using the Union State to promote himself to the ruler of Moscow. The formula that somebody used was oil for kisses, or gas for kisses. The oil for food program that the UN had, and this was oil for kisses, meaning that Lukashenko would ask for subsidies, for economic help, for political help, for protection from the patron, from Moscow, but in return he would not give any tangible assets, right? He would just demonstrate that he's an ally and talk about brotherly love and all these things that cost nothing to anyone, and that came to be known as gas for kisses or oil for kisses. Right? And of course, I mean, this is in itself a fascinating story because in technical terms, if you look at the size of Russia, and if you look at the size of Belarus, if you look at the size of their economies, their military, political influence, everything. I mean, they're incomparable, right? But they're nowhere near each other. But Lukashenko was able, and he was very clever in this. He managed to create a situation where Russia became dependent on him, not in economic terms, and not even so much in military terms, although he was indeed a military ally of Russia and remains so. But Russia became dependent on him in a symbolic way, right? Because this kind of imperial ego, this quest for status, this quest for sphere of influence, was something that did not allow the Kremlin to lose Belarus, right? Because of this image of the last ally. And this is why often this looked like it was the other way around. It was the tail wagging the dog, meaning that Lukashenko managed to exert an influence which clearly did not correspond to the objective numbers, right? It's a small country that in theory would not have been of particular interest to a great power, but because he managed to exploit symbolic things, this imperial identity, right? This trauma of losing an empire, that's what he exploited. He created a situation of mutual dependence. He was dependent on Russia for political and economic support, but Russia was equally dependent on Belarus or on Lukashenko for this kind of these symbolic things, for having at least one ally. Right? Now, in 2008, we had a kind of a game changer in the region, right? Which was the 5-day war, the Russian-Georgian war. And presumably, that got people in Minsk thinking that we're now facing a different Russia, right? It is not kind of weak Russia of Yeltsin that was very easy to exploit, to manipulate. It would do little in response, but it was a Russia that could actually use military force against the post-Soviet state. So that was a bit of a game changer in the region. Right? That was long before the Ukraine crisis in Crimea. And this coincided with the launching of the Eastern Partnership, the European Union's initiative for the 6 post-Soviet states. Belarus happened to be included. After many years of isolation, Belarus managed to be included in the Eastern Partnership. Now, for the EU, it was a chance to try a different approach to Lukashenko, because it had been sanctioning him for many years, and he was still there. So the EU probably thought, well, the sticks don't work. Let's try the carrots. Let's try to engage with Belarus, and maybe we could somehow push Lukashenko towards some form of reform, because we know that there have been transitions, even authoritarian transitions from authoritarian regimes to democracies. I mean, if you look at Francoist Spain, for instance, I mean, that was once Spain was a dictatorship, and then Spain was a democracy, and it became a member of the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. So economic reform, so on. So why not try carrots in order to maybe induce Minsk towards some form of reform? For Lukashenko, of course, the rationale was very different. He probably realized that he's very, very dependent on Russia. And in the new circumstances of Russia becoming more assertive, more aggressive even, he wanted to balance Russian influence by developing closer ties with the European Union, right? And this, of course, would make it easier for him to blackmail Russia, right? By saying that, okay, I don't have you only, but I also have the EU, who is now prepared to cooperate with me. They've changed their approach. So it was a way of increasing his value in the eyes of Moscow, right? So this is a well-known tactic of balancing between two centers of power. So Belarus became this kind of liminal player, right? On the one hand, it was very closely allied with Russia, and then there was the Union State. The other hand, there was the Eastern Partnership. So it was an attempt to play both sides against each other, and to milk two cows, as somebody said at some point, right? Milking two cows at the same time. In 2015, however, Belarus, together with Russia and Kazakhstan, became a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which wasn't the first attempt by Russia to reintegrate the post-Soviet space, as you probably know. There is a number, dozens actually, of these projects of bringing the post-Soviet countries together under the aegis of Russia, of course. And of course, as usual, this was a project that was deeply rooted in this imperial or post-imperial identity, right? In Russia not being able to give up what it saw as a sphere of influence, right? Although it was, of course, decorated in economic terms, but it was clearly a political project. Now, the difference, one of the big differences here is, of course, that the Eurasian Economic Union was built on a previously existing customs union. So Belarus became a member of a customs union together with Russia. And this has pretty important implications for the future because, as you might or might not know, being a member of a customs union means that you are not free to join other similar projects. So you cannot be a member of a customs union and with Russia and have a free trade agreement, be a member of a free trade area, let's say, together with the European Union. Right. So this was the thing. Let's say in the 2013-2014 Ukraine crisis. Because you couldn't have overlapping customs unions and free trade areas, Ukraine had to choose between either being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union or signing a DCFTA, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. Right? So effectively, after Belarus became a member of this customs union, it was locked into a Russian-sponsored project of economic integration, which makes participating in European integration by signing an association agreement, for example, more difficult, right? So it narrows down the room for alternative policy, foreign policies, and well. If you ask me in January what I think about the future of all this, of Belarus and its policy of balancing between the East and the West, or Russia and the EU, I would say that this is going to go on for a very long time. Right? This so-called multi-vectored foreign policy, which is a nice name for geopolitical opportunism, or for milking two cows at the same time, as somebody once said. We thought this would go on indefinitely, because Lukashenko tried to extract not only from Russia or the EU, he also tried to develop closer relationship with China. If you look at this picture here, this is a picture. It looks like, you know, it's a picture of a screen in a Chinese airport, but no, this is Minsk. This is Minsk. And I was, I mean, I had this personal experience. I came to Minsk on a flight, and I tried to, you know, to find something, and I realized that everything is in Chinese. So actually there are three languages: Chinese, English, and Russian, and no Belarusian. Imagine, you know, no Latvian in Latvia, for instance. So that tells you something about how much these people care about history and culture and all these things. So yeah, so it was a sign of being open to new opportunities, to China, for instance, as this big alternative supposedly to Russia and the European Union. But obviously China is a very different player, right? China is a very different player in the sense of being much more pragmatic, much more business oriented, and much less willing to sponsor identity-driven projects, unlike Russia. So, like I said, we thought this would be going on for a very long time, but this is the thing with changes. They often come very unexpectedly, suddenly, right? You have these black swans flying in every once in a while. So, following the August election, you know, if you want to use that word, we had what came to be known as the Awakening of Belarus. Right? Now, I tried to collect a set of explanations here. Now, of course, they're not finalized explanations. Right? There's still research that needs to be done on accounting for what happened in Belarus in 2020. Right? But this is what we think, you know, might explain what happened, right? By authoritarian dead end, I mean that basically this is a kind of a natural erosion or natural aging of the regime in Minsk. If you compare 2020 to, let's say, 2009, 2010, I mean, the regime was certainly authoritarian back then, but there are some notions that maybe, you know, with this rapprochement with the EU, something could actually change, something could evolve in the direction of something, you know, more economically prosperous, more progressive from that point of view. There are all these ideas about authoritarian modernization, of having some kind of an Eastern European Singapore, of modernizing Belarus under Lukashenko, but with the EU's assistance, of a gradual transition maybe in the future, you know, in accordance with modernization theory. Economic growth and growth in living standards brings democracy, not immediately, but with time. By 2020, it was obvious that none of that was happening, that Lukashenko had no intention of changing anything at all in Belarus, that he was not interested in structural economic reforms. He was not interested in what the EU was telling him. He was not interested in what the IMF was telling him. He was not interested in anything. Basically, he was interested in one thing, to remain in power as long as possible and to preserve the political system unchanged as long as possible. So forget about authoritarian modernization. So I guess many people understood that this is actually really, truly a dead end, the political system that he built. There will be no gradual transformation or modernization or anything like that. In parallel to that, you had a considerable shrinking of the so-called stability, right? The kind of mantra, the keyword that that Lukashenko always used, that we need to preserve stability, and we need to make sure that the 90s never come back and the people are not impoverished, etc., etc. So there's a kind of a paternalist state in Belarus that Lukashenko built, that was built on redistributing money, wealth, right? Trying to help one social group at the expense of another, and then helping that social group at the expense of another. So, the kind of paternalistic relationship that that a government develops with its citizens, and that all that was dying. It was shrinking, and it was more and more obvious that actually the regime could not deliver on the promises that it made, that Belarus is going to grow economically, and that people would have a modest but tolerable standard of living. None of that was happening, right? So there was progressive disappointment with the gradual impoverishment, and then there's of course the kind of very spectacular denialism of the COVID-19 pandemic, when Lukashenko just basically showed people that he doesn't care whether they die, whether they live or die. And that, among other things, well, first of all, it showed the people that the state really doesn't care about them, which is the opposite of what a paternalist state should do, right? I mean, the paternalist state should take care of the people, and here it's just, ignoring a life or death matter. And also because it's a life or death matter, people started to look apparently for different sources of information. So this is where the new social media come in. People, many of them, we suppose, stopped trusting the official media, which they consumed previously, and they looked for alternative information sources. That is the new social media, like the Telegram channels, which cannot be censored, neither can they be blocked. And they probably discovered, a new universe there, a new political universe. In parallel to that, and also with the help of social media, Telegram and Viber and other social media, you had a very notable growth of these local communities, where people would exchange information and help each other. In the local communities, let's say their districts or residential areas, and that after the political crisis erupted, actually translated into very fascinating forms of horizontal solidarity, of people helping each other, of people feeling that they belong to the same community, let's say the same apartment building or the same residential area. So there's this kind of local community and local identity, very grassroots thing emerging. Also, we suppose partially because of the COVID-19 crisis, where people had to cooperate, and the civil society basically tried to fulfill that role, which was supposed to be played by the government, by the state. Just to switch for a second to this slide. This is the kind of conventional white, red, white flag, which Lukashenko suppressed for many, many years. But this is a flag of a residential area, which is called Hrushovka. So it refers to a pear. I mean, it used to be a village, obviously, before it became part of Minsk. But now it's a residential area, and it's also a metro stop. So people are making these flags, and they're coming to the rallies with these flags, where you see different parts of Minsk carrying different flags. And I mean, this shows you on the symbolic level the kind of growth of these local communities and local identities. So a very grassroots thing, like I said, which is not something that happened in previous years. I mean, this is what people are saying. Now we meet, we talk, we have tea together, we share food, we bake together. we know each other. We never knew each other before that. We didn't know. We had no idea who was living in the apartment nearby, and now we know each other. Like, we cooperate. So these horizontal ties have been established, and that's something that of course you cannot erase so easily. Right? Even if you suppress the protests, it's very difficult to destroy this kind of spontaneous civil society that has been forming in Belarus. Okay, I've been talking for 45 minutes, which means that I need to come to some sort of a conclusion. And the best way to do that is, of course, to speculate on the future, because this is very much, of course, an open-ended story. Now, I put question marks I put question marks next to these hypothetical scenarios. There's one thing that does not have a question mark. That is the point of no return, which is quite clear. It's quite obvious, right? There's no way that Belarus can go back to how it was prior to 2020 and prior to the August election, because internally the regime has been significantly delegitimized. This is not to say it has no supporters. I mean, it does have a certain number of supporters, because independent opinion polls are practically banned in Belarus. It's impossible to conduct independent opinion polls. We don't know the precise numbers, but there are some supporters of Lukashenko still in the country, obviously, and not only among the police and the so-called law enforcement. But it's also clear, it's visibly clear that it has been delegitimized. So a lot of people lost trust in the government. So you cannot go back to the previous political model. Also, it has been delegitimized internationally. So for Lukashenko, it will be very difficult or virtually impossible to play the same type of multi-vectored foreign policy or the kind of geopolitical opportunism that he's been playing for years. I think that window of opportunities is now closed. That door is closed. Right. But where does this go from here? Well, there's the happy scenario, of democratic transition and Lukashenko fleeing to Russia, maybe to Moscow, maybe to Rostov to see Yanukovych. But then there's less happy scenarios, because he has no intention of leaving, and he also has no broad support in Belarus. Well, the only logical solution is, of course, to increase the level of repression, right? So we might be in for a different edition of authoritarianism, which would resemble tougher totalitarian regimes much more. So it would be kind of a police state, right? Also, we could see an escalation of violence, of course, because what started as the Belarus Awakening started as a series of peaceful protests, but they were peaceful only from one side, because as you probably know, the police and the unidentified people who are presumably part of the police, they've used violence on a scale that was unprecedented, even for Belarus, right? These mass repressions, mass terror. So, of course, there is a consensus among the people who participate in the protests that this must be peaceful. But also the question is, how long can you answer violence with nonviolence? And this is something that also people from the outside. I mean, there are people from let's say Russia or from Ukraine who are very eager sometimes to provide advice. They're saying, no, you're not going to accomplish anything with peaceful, this kind of Gandhian peaceful protests, that you need to do this and this and this. You need to capture the buildings. Of course, people who are writing this don't realize that this is a different country in a different situation, and what works in Ukraine doesn't necessarily work in Belarus. But still, there's the question of how sustainable these peaceful reactions are, because sometimes violence can escalate completely spontaneously, right? In relation to that, you might wonder how the EU might respond to either the increase in the growth in the level of terror, or to mass violence, and whether there is not a prospect of broader economic sanctions introduced by the EU and the US against Belarus, or against Lukashenko rather, and his supporters. And this is an open question for now, because introducing broader, not targeted sanctions against individuals, like travel bans and asset freezes, but broad economic sanctions, that of course is something that requires a great deal of political responsibility, and walking in the shoes of European politicians, you would know that you were taking a great risk and a great responsibility onto yourself. But unfortunately, it might come to a situation where the EU would have to do something like that in order to preserve its face, right? Or it might forget about might have to forget about its image as a normative power, or an entity which is built on values. Then there's my God, I'm running out of time. There's the other geopolitical player, which is Russia, and which of course has several reasons to be unhappy with Lukashenko. First of all, because from their perspective, the protests are setting a very, very bad example for the Russians themselves. We know that Putin is paranoid about the so-called color revolutions. He's what they call Maidanophobic. He's afraid of color revolutions. So very bad example for the Kremlin. But also it shows that the protests show that Lukashenko does not have the situation under control, and that his legitimacy can be questioned, and that also anything he signs, any agreements, any deals he signs with Russia can also be questioned subsequently, because he might not be a legitimate representative of Belarus. So Russia wants the crisis to be resolved, and it's apparently proposing a kind of a reform which would not make Belarus a democracy, but what they call a managed democracy, right? So a more flexible, a more kind of nuanced, a more sophisticated form of authoritarianism or hybrid regime, fashioned after the Russian style. The problem with that is, of course, Lukashenko is not very keen on that, and he never was, right? Otherwise, he would have done that a long time ago. So apparently he's been pressured by Russia into something like that. And I'm afraid that the so-called constitutional reform, that is what it is called, kind of a transition without genuine democracy, that constitutional reform it might become something like the Union State, where Lukashenko would be promising constantly, yes, that is our goal, we're going to integrate, but you have to understand that we cannot do this immediately, and we have this problem and we have that problem, and he would be, he would make this a never-ending story. I think that's what he intends to do, actually, to promise something and then not to fulfill his promise, which is his usual political style when it comes to Russia as well. So the Russian concept, it's a very authentic concept of Kidalova, of not fulfilling your promise. That has been the political style. And then there's the last and final scenario, which of course Russia and the EU striking some sort of a deal on Belarus, which is a scenario that I don't see as a particularly likely one, considering the difficult background of relations between Russia and the EU that we have at the moment. Okay, sorry if I went over the time limit. I will stop here.
Thank you, Alexei. And now we have a chance to ask the questions. And while our participants are thinking about the questions they have, by the way, Krista, please help me, because today we had some problems with raising hands, and I'm a bit afraid
Yes.
if it will work tonight. So I have a question regarding Belarusian army and Belarusian security services. So there were indications that there are still those militaries who are rather loyal to Russia than to Lukashenko. And we saw it during exercises like, for example, Zapad, when Russian soldiers cooperated with the Belarusian soldiers. And basically, Lukashenko was very angry at the end of the day because he didn't know about the movements which happened. And after this, there was a pretty huge cleaning in the army. So, are there any indications that there could be some maybe still loyalty to Russians, and could it give some impact on how the Belarusian future will look like, for example, turnover or whatever?
I'm not sure if I understand correctly. Are you asking about conflicting loyalties? About
loyalties of Belarusian army officers towards Russia, and not really towards Lukashenko?
Well, I mean, one thing that you certainly need to take into account is, of course, that the Belarusian army tends to be very pro-Russian in the cultural sense, right? And the kind of sense of shared Russian-Soviet legacies. And so there are different types of loyalty, right? You can be politically loyal to the Kremlin on the personal level, or also you can be politically loyal to, let's say, I don't know, Lukashenko, but also mentally, culturally close to Russia. I don't think that Lukashenko would ever risk putting in charge those people that are personally that could not, that you know, that could happen to be more loyal to, let's say, Putin or the Kremlin than to him. I think he's very careful about that. I think he's been making sure that both the army and, what's more important, of course, the secret services are handpicked by him. And those are people who are loyal to him personally, not to Putin, not to the Kremlin. On the one hand. On the other hand, though, it's true that these people are kind of culturally loyal to Russia. I mean, they think in very similar categories. They are loyal on the kind of a deeper level, if you know what I mean, right? So, and that's not something that something that you can eradicate. Well, I mean, because Lukashenko is also loyal to Russia in that sense. I mean, he's that's what he says every once in a while, that I am, I am alien. I'm an alien to the Europeans. You know, I'm mentally, culturally, I'm a Soviet man, or a Russian man, or whatever, and that's true. I mean, he doesn't know any foreign languages. He doesn't speak English. You know, that naturally puts him in this Soviet Russian cultural milieu. And the same is true of the Belarusian army. I mean, with exceptions, of course, but you know, en masse. So there's personal loyalty and there's kind of cultural loyalty. And I think the second one is much stronger with the Belarusian army.
Okay, thank you. And now I see that we have already questions, and I wanted to ask participants, those who want to ask the questions, please turn on cameras as well so we could see you. And the first question comes from Jakobs Rasnach. Yes, Jakobs, please.
So hello, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. It was really interesting and informing about the situation in Belarus. And my question is about some of the movements what I have read previously on news, which I found actually really interesting. Well, they work with, as far as I understand, with the Coordination Council, and they are called the Anarchist Black Cross Revolutionary Action on Prague. And they are also against Lukashenko regime. And it's so interesting, like from a political perspective, that there are like even like these anarchist organizations which are like fighting against Lukashenko, and who is like financing even them. Yeah, it's really interesting, and it would be really interesting to know. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I haven't researched into the anarchist movement, but I mean, even if you don't know much about this, you could easily assume that the anarchist movement and Lukashenko's authoritarian state are natural enemies, because anarchism is all about making the state, which it sees as repressive, as absent as possible from our lives, if you will. Right. Now, the really interesting thing about the protest movement and this kind of awakening, I'm not calling it a revolution, but it's a political awakening, is that, of course, it unites many people with different political views and different geopolitical views, and different axiological preferences, if you will. Right? So the conservatives and the liberals, and there is one focal point which unites these people, and that focal point is we want to put an end to violence. We want free and fair elections, and we finally want somebody else in charge of the country. That is the kind of broadest common denominator, and that's just how it works for the moment. I can easily imagine that these people are probably going to become mortal political enemies if and when Lukashenko is gone. That they're going to be at each other's throats. So the anarchists are going to be fighting the nationalists, and the conservatives are going to be fighting the liberals. But for now, there's a broad common denominator, and I'm not, from that point of view, I'm not at all surprised that the anarchists, if they're cooperating with the Coordination Council, that they're doing that. I have no information on who is funding them or anything like that.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Paul Sixness. Yes, Paul, please.
Good evening, and of course, thank you for your insightful and interesting presentation about the history of this quite special regime, if you can say so, my question concerns the protesters. In your opinion, like what do you think? Like, how long are they going to be able to protest in the future? Because they have been on the streets since August, and it has to stop. And it has to stop at some point. So so like in your opinion, how long are the protests going to continue?
I see. Thanks. Well, you probably need to start by saying that there are different types of protests, right? So what started the protests in August started as decentralized protests, right? So they're in, let's say, they're in different parts of Minsk, and also in the other towns and smaller cities and even villages. So it was very much decentralized, right? Then it became more centralized because we had these marches. Right? So there are these impressive pictures from Minsk. So the Independence Square that you're seeing behind my back was full of people, and the Independence Avenue was also full of people, and it was this kind of sea of people. Right, so they were more centralized, these marches. Then the regime realized that these are very dangerous images of political majorities. So it, in the past couple of weeks, has been trying to suppress these protests by not allowing people to assemble into a single march. So basically, it had to go back to the decentralized format. Now, why am I saying all this? Because when you are asking about how long, well, obviously we don't have a crystal ball, and nothing can go on forever. But also, you need to realize that there can be different types of protests, and the protests don't necessarily need to die down. They can just take a different form, right? Which actually happened in the past 2 weeks. People were protesting locally, which of course makes it a lot more difficult for the police to suppress these rallies if they are dispersed and they're in different places at once. It doesn't give you the impressive kind of picture, but it makes the police completely helpless in some cases, because they don't know where to go. There are so many different places in Minsk where these people are gathering. So this might very well be an end to the rallies that we saw on Sundays, but these local forms of protest can go on for a very long time. And for now, there's no indication that these people are prepared to go back to business as usual. I mean, this is, of course, what Lukashenko would like to see, that, going back to the Belarus that we knew before August 2020. And that's his mantra. He's saying that, okay, all right, time to stop, we're going back. No, I don't think that's happening. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of resolution in these people. They want to continue, maybe in different forms. And I'm sorry, I'm not able to, have a crystal ball and tell you exactly how long.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauls. And now we have a question from Ilya Kozins.
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Mr. Kazharski. I would like to hear your opinion about the topic uh, of the policy of European Union in respect to Belarus. So, given the current events, what policy should the European Union choose in respect to Belarus? And my second question is, um, if we look realistically, then how would you imagine this power transition in case when people, when Belarusians, win this fight against Lukashenko? He, let's imagine, resigns. Then how would this
No,
power? No, so
I cannot imagine that.
okay. So, anyways, I would like to hear your answer to my first question. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is a question, of course, that I'm asked all the time. What should we do, or what should the EU do? Well, I mean, it's very simple. You need to do two things. You need to, first of all, let the people of Belarus know that they're not alone, that they're not abandoned, that the EU is watching, and the EU sees what's going on. That's on the more kind of moral and ethical side, but on the more substantial side, although that's also important, but on the more substantial side, I would say have a plan for Belarus. Have a plan for Belarus after Lukashenko, and make that very clear and very known also to the people of Belarus, that the EU has a plan for Belarus. Because it is often said that basically that democratic efforts are useless because changes never bring good things, and that nobody cares about you in Europe and nobody cares about you anywhere. So, why bother? Why go through all these difficulties if nothing good awaits you in the end? So the EU needs to have a plan for Belarus, and it needs to understand that this is going to be a process, and that it's not a single event, it's not a single protest, not a single election. This is a process of transition, which has already begun, whether we like it or not, whether Lukashenko likes it or not. But there's, like I said, there's no going back. This is a point of no return. And your second question, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but if Lukashenko was psychologically prepared to resign and to organize some kind of a power transition, he would have done that a long time ago. He would have done that during the crisis. He would have done that before the crisis. He could have done that 10 years ago or 5 years ago when the situation was stable. And he could have organized something like, I don't know, they speak of a Kazakhstani scenario, when the president leaves, but he sort of stays in the background, and there's a gradual transition to a new model. But that's not something that's going to happen. I think that by now we know the psychology quite well. I mean, it's psychologically impossible to part with power. And I think the person in question was actually quite clear on that. He said he would have to kill me before there will be any new elections. So I don't think I have a better answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Renate Grudule.
Okay, good evening. I'm sorry, I can't turn on my camera because it just has given up. But nevertheless, thank you for your lecture. And my question, and my question will be actually quite similar to the previous one regarding EU and Belarus relations. But I would like to hear them in a context. What would happen? What will or would happen? In the future, if we think about some changes that might happen in Belarus. Now, I'm not exactly talking about the policy that EU should release right now, but what could happen in future.
But I'm not sure I understand in which of the possible futures.
This is a good question. Let's keep on the positive track that Belarus becomes more democratic, and how you see these relationship could develop.
With the EU?
Yes, with the EU.
Well, I mean, there's certain limits, right, to Belarus's relationship with the EU, even if it changes its form of government, even if it becomes a democracy, because, like I already said, Belarus is a member of not one but several Russian-sponsored international organizations. So there's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a kind of a clone of NATO, on paper at least. And then there's the Eurasian Economic Union, which means that Belarus is deeply locked into these structures, international structures that are sponsored by Russia. So it's difficult to imagine. It's difficult to imagine that the Belarus would, for instance, sign an association agreement with the European Union soon after the hypothetical transition. And actually, this is what most of the leaders of the so-called Coordination Council are saying, that. Well, I mean, to some extent, this is just not to make Moscow too nervous, but they're saying we have no intention of withdrawing from these Russian-sponsored organizations. Now, of course, the funny thing about democracy is it can be quite unpredictable, right? What the people of Belarus are going to say about Belarus's foreign policy choices, that's not something that we can quite predict, right? And that's why Putin doesn't like democracy, because it's very unpredictable. You can strike an agreement with a political leader, and then the next election cycle you have a different political leader with a different outlook, and that's just so damn annoying, for a KGB guy who's used to controlling everything, having everything under control. That's just too irritating. So that's why they don't like democracy in the so-called Near Abroad, right? So it's difficult to say, but at least sorry, excuse me. At least I can say this much, that Belarus is probably going to be closer to the European Union, which is something that everybody can benefit from. But it's not going to be too close, at least not immediately, not too soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now we have the final question from Jurgis Kalniņš, since we are running out of time. Yes, Jurgis, please.
Perfect, thank you. Good evening. Really grateful that we had the chance to listen to your comprehensive presentation. You sort of killed my question. I had something similar about like the future potential elections, but with you saying that's very unlikely, and that Lukashenko himself said that he needs to be dead, killed, whatever, in order for elections to take place, that it's something unimaginable currently, then my question would be, I don't want to believe that it's unimaginable, because like half a year ago, at least here in Latvia, no one could have predicted the all the protests that are happening now and that have been happening for the past 3 months.
Yes, and more importantly, not only in Latvia but also in Belarus, we couldn't have predicted it.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
That's
No
the best
one,
thing.
yeah, that's the thing. No one predicted that. Therefore, is it really that unpredictable that maybe, I don't know, he like passes away, legitimately steps down, saying that the sanctions are too hard, or something else happens, the society riots, or is that like really that unimaginable?
Well,
That's not really a question, but
I mean, yes, imagination is more important than knowledge, said Einstein. So of course you have to use it every once in a while. But and you write about the black swans, right? You cannot predict certain things. You can explain them retrospectively, but you cannot predict them. So you're absolutely right on this count. I mean, from the psychology of the individual in question, we know that he's prepared to go, to great lengths in order to preserve power, and he's made that very clear. And under the present conditions, he has no intentions of stepping down, and doesn't have to have. He doesn't seem to have any intention to actually reform anything, right? The political system. I mean, of course, it might come to a scenario where he needs to choose between his life and power, and in that case, I guess he may choose life, running away. But that's a very hypothetical scenario that we don't see right now. Right? I don't think anybody is capable of convincing him of stepping down while he's more or less in control of the law enforcement and the security apparatus. That's the most important thing. Yeah. I mean, the Russians would have loved this. I mean, they would have loved a pro-Russian candidate who would be elected instead of Lukashenko, and he would be much easier to do business with for many reasons. But that's not a present they're going to get, I'm afraid.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for very interesting lecture, and I would say very valuable for all of us, since we got a lot of new things to think about, for sure. And thank you, participants, for joining us here tonight. And hope to hear more from you in the future, Alex. Thank you very much. And as I know that some of you will have some other lectures later on. So thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your questions and comments. It was really interesting. I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.